Welcome. CitizenU.org presents The 12.
We are the two teachers.
And we will be deliberating on how to cram for your exam, the AP government exam.
Today's finding, the foundations of democracy.
Andy, this sounds like Unit 1, and we really began with balancing that power between the government and our own individual liberty. Andy, that sounds like an enduring principle.
It is an enduring principle, and we see this throughout the founding, from our first government, the Articles of Confederation, into the Constitution and into the Bill of Rights. So let's not hesitate. Let's get into those learning objectives.
Let's talk about those primary documents, Andy. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution talk about some really important ideals we find in our government.
Well, one key ideal that a lot of American government students forget is the idea of limited government. And when American government students today hear of limited government, they think of a weak government. But when we're talking about limited government, we're talking about a government that can't tell us where to live, where to work, where to go to school. It has limits.
We like those inalienable rights, the Declaration said, Andy, and these are our natural rights. They're not created by men. They are ours at birth, natural rights. We also love popular sovereignty. We, the people, is found in the Constitution. Ultimately, the legitimacy of our government is in the consent of the governed.
But we also like republicanism, and we saw this in the Articles and in the Constitution. And this is the idea that we, the people, many times elect officials who make policy decisions for us. That's the republic. That's representative government.
Andy, let's just make sure we know the distinction between the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. The Declaration really affirms popular sovereignty, and the U.S. Constitution is the charter of our government. It's a blueprint of what our government is supposed to be doing.
Yes. Now, we should also teach about the models of representative democracy, starting with participatory democracy. And this can be kind of confusing because participatory democracy can be voting for representatives, which we do at the national, state, and local level, but we also can have referenda. We can have direct ballot initiatives in particular states or local communities where voters have specific choices, voting yes or no on policies.
And if I were to argue, I think the model of democracy that our founders pushed out the most was pluralistic. A pluralistic democracy is a democracy in which groups organize, factions, interest groups, political parties, and they compete against each other to get their policies completed. Andy, this is pluralism.
But let's not kid ourselves. We also have elite democracy in this country as well, particularly in times of crisis, both economic and foreign policy crisis. We know that the government relies on those elites, those people who are the experts, and government relies on those elites to guide their policy.
Well, Andy, those elites made mistakes, and let's not forget that enduring principle that under the Articles of Confederation, you know, that first governing charter, a failure, Andy. The Articles of Confederation did not make it. What were its weaknesses?
Well, the key weakness was you had no executive branch, which made sense because the revolutionaries were suspicious of putting too much executive power into one person. But you also had a very weak central government, particularly as it related to economic power. You had a central government that essentially could not regulate trade between the different states.
Well, we know that early on, even during the American Revolution, factions formed to fight over these policies. And once the revolution was won, we had two primary parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalist Papers, those essays the Federalists wrote that argued why we needed a stronger central government, fought against the Anti-Federalists, kind of creative name. The Anti-Federalists were worried about that big, strong central government. And they wrote essays too, like Brutus I, that argued for the importance of smaller units, more localized, more agricultural.
And one of the most important Federalist papers was Federalist 10 by James Madison, who argued that if you had large republics, that could be very healthy for democracy, because in a large republic, you would have many different groups competing for power, which would mean that no one group would become tyrannical and oppress the minority groups.
Or here's a novel idea that Ultimately, our new Constitution would only be ratified if the founders understood the importance of negotiation and compromise. And Andy, in our original Constitution, there are a number of key compromises. In fact, one is great. The Great Compromise, which created a bicameral legislature. Rather than having one legislature, one body of lawmakers, we compromised and made two, a House and a Senate. One was based on population and another based on just statehood, the Senate and the House.
But we also know there's some tragic compromises, particularly related to slavery. And the 3/5 compromise, we know, was put in place so that those southern slave states would feel that they had and did have more power in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. We also had a slave compromise allowing the importation of slaves for 20 years. These two compromises, tragic for many reasons, including that it set up this inevitable conflict in the Civil War.
Well, those founders weren't shy of controversy either. They understood that their constitution they were creating may be in fact a living document, Andy, and in Article 5 they introduced a way to change the Constitution. We call this the amendment process.
The amendment process, where essentially Congress, the national government, proposes amendments with 2/3 of each chamber, the House and the Senate, but then you need 3/4 of states to ratify those amendments. So when you have national government powers merging with state powers, that amendment process embodies federalism.
Oh, I love federalism. And Andy, these debates that the Federalists had with the anti-Federalists, a lot of issues weren't resolved. And that's the beauty of the government we're now in, that we're still founding and framing this government charter. And Andy, there are issues today that still call back to those early issues.
Well, particularly when you have questions about national security, as we saw after September 11th, 2001, we know that the national government, the executive branch specifically, tends to grow in more power with things like the Patriot Act and FISA surveillance after national crises.
Andy, the Constitution is filled with basic principles, and at its core is a competition between policymakers. This isn't just because we like gamesmanship, but because we're afraid that if power were in one place, we'd be heading towards tyranny. So we really bought into this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances.
And you see those concepts articulated in Federalist 51, which essentially was explaining to the country and essentially a rebuttal to the anti-federalists that this system of separate branches of the government that had checks and balances over each other would make sure that no one branch would become too powerful in the constitutional government.
Andy, what I like about separation of powers and federalism is that it's really had you and me in mind, the citizen. This wasn't just an elite government. They wanted us to be involved, and so we have numbers of access points. We have access to a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch. We have access to our state governments, our local governments. Andy, the joy of federalism and the joy of the separation of powers.
Checks and balances can also be seen in the ultimate example of impeachment of executive officials or impeachment of federal judges, where the House can bring impeachment charges. They can accuse an impeachment, and then the trial for impeachment to remove an official from power takes a 2/3 consent by the U.S. Senate.
Andy, we've thrown around this word federalism, and maybe we need to dig just a little bit deeper, because also at its core, the U.S. Constitution wasn't just about a central government. It was about distributing power across the states. We call this federalism.
Well, federalism, in terms of an exclusive power of the national government, you would see the military power, specifically to nuclear weapons. That's an exclusive power to the national government, while we have a whole host of concurrent powers. Sometimes that's called marble cake federalism.
Oh, I love marble cake.
And this is the idea that on education policy, you have in any public school in America some national laws that influence public schools, some state laws, some local laws. Those are shared powers or concurrent powers.
Well, despite the fact, Andy, that our founders may have envisioned this perfect federalism where we balance the power between a national government and the states and local governments, clearly the story of America is the story of federal aggrandizement. the national government has assumed more and more power and authority. And they've done this with sticks and carrots.
Well, sticks and carrots is the metaphor for different types of grants. So, for instance, the national government can offer grants or money to state and local governments to carry out certain outcomes. Sometimes those are mandates. So, for instance, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a mandate from the national government to make schools and other public buildings accessible to the disabled. Sometimes the government will offer very specific grants to follow through on those mandates called categorical grants. And sometimes those grants are more broad and give state and local government more discretion on how to spend that money. That's, of course, is called a block grant.
Well, let's not think the states are defenseless or powerless over this aggrandizement. Andy, let's not forget about the 10th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, even, well, have we talked about the Commerce Clause yet?
We know the Commerce Clause really contributes to the national government growing in power to the point where the Commerce Clause was used to even desegregate racial desegregation of public facilities in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But we know there are limits to the Commerce Clause, specifically laid out in the Supreme Court case of U.S. v. Lopez, where the Supreme Court said the national government could not use the Commerce Clause to prohibit gun possession near public schools.
Let's just lay that out more clearly, Andy, because this is muddled. Federalism is a tension. We know the 10th Amendment guarantees states' rights. There are reserved powers to the states. But yet the Constitution has the Supremacy Clause. McCulloch v. Maryland affirms this, that the United States government is supreme over the states. But still, through Supreme Court decisions like U.S. v. Lopez that you mentioned, states still have some authority and sovereignty left, that the United States government can't do whatever it wants.
Correct.
Although it sounds like they can.
We should also remember there are multiple access points created by this system of checks and balances and federalism. And what that means is you have a lot of different government officials at the national, state, local, and in the different branches of government who can address policy. If environmentalism is your thing, you know you can affect environmentalism at the national level with the executive branch policies, with our national Congress, but also at the state and local government levels.
Andy, feels like we've just gone through an essential list of what you and I need to know when studying American government and politics at the foundations level, the foundations of democracy, that tension between government power and individual liberty. We're the two teachers, no fancy suits,
no fancy words,
plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.